Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Creative Confidence Podcast. I'm your host, Mina Seetharaman. Uncertainty is the birthplace of possibility. That's what today's guest told me, and honestly, by the end of our conversation, I believed him, even though I walked in thinking I already understood uncertainty pretty well. I'm joined today by Simone Stolzoff, journalist, author, TED speaker, and former design lead at IDEO, which means he's part of our extended family here. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and National Geographic. His first book, The Good Enough Job, is a deeply reported look at how work became the center of so many of our identities and what we lose when we build our sense of self around our jobs. His new book, How to Not Know, is out now. It asks a question that I think is just as urgent. What do we do when we don't have the answers? How do we lead, decide, and move forward when the path isn't clear? Simone spent years reporting this book, interviewing scientists, philosophers, business leaders, and people facing some of the hardest decisions of their lives. And what he found challenges a lot about what we've been taught. What I love about Simone is that he's as poetic as he is practical. He'll tell you a story that genuinely moves you, and then land it with something you can take back to your team, your work, your own life. We talk about why certainty is so seductive and so dangerous, about 3 traps that even the most experienced leaders fall into, and about a concept called ghost ships that I haven't stopped thinking about since we recorded. This is one of those conversations that stays with you. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Here's my conversation with Simone Stolzoff. Hi, Simone. Welcome to the Creative Confidence Podcast. It's amazing to have you here, and especially to have you part of the series that we've been wanting to do for a while on uncertainty, which I think feels pretty timely for our listeners. It's a topic that's come up pretty regularly for us. And your first book, The Good Enough Job, came out in 2023. It's a really very well-reported book, and a deep look at how work kind of became the center of so many people's lives, and such a key part of all of our identities, and what we actually lose when we tie our sense of selves to our jobs. And it struck a nerve with a lot of people who were rethinking that relationship, especially coming out of the pandemic. I know I did a lot of very deep thinking coming out of the pandemic, in relationship to sort of who I was and who I was in relationship to my own work. And now you have this second book. It asks the question that I think is just as urgent and pressing for people, which is, what do we do when we don't have all the answers? How do we lead? How we decide? How do we move forward when the path isn't always clear? And so I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. But maybe on the surface, maybe those feel like different or separate topics, but I have a sense that they might be a little bit connected. Is there a thread for you? What might that be? And what kind of led you from that first book, The Good Enough Job, to How Not to Know?
Well, first, thanks for having me back.
Yeah.
It feels like a homecoming in a way, even though it's my authorly duty to say that your workplace is not your family, but it does feel like I am coming back to the IDEO family. The books are related, but not sequels, if that makes sense. So the first book about work and identity really asked the question of how work came to be so central to our lives. And as I went out into the world and discussed it with readers, the most common question I would get is, okay, but how should I think about the future of my job, the future of my industry, with all of this disruption on the horizon? And, part of me as a journalist, as an author, wanted to pontificate about my beliefs about the future of work. But another part of me, maybe the more human part of me, wanted to throw up my hands and say, I don't know. I don't know what the future of work looks like. I don't know what the future of your job will mean. And so in many ways, the second book is a response to that question, though it doesn't discuss exclusively the future of uncertainty in careers. This question of how to get better at dealing with what we don't know is something that is permeating our work lives, our politics, our sense of who we are. And so the meta skill that I hope people glean from the book, and maybe from this conversation today as well, is being able to persist in spite of not knowing exactly where you're going.
And you actually recently wrote a Harvard Business Review story, and the numbers there were really interesting. We'll link to it in our show notes for the listeners. But I think it tells this story really well that, the 5 highest measurements of global economic policy uncertainty since researchers began tracking it in the 80s have all come up in the last 5 years. Mentions of uncertainty in Glassdoor employee reviews are up 80% year over year. The word uncertainty itself has appeared in 87% of public earnings statements in early 2025. We are living through something that feels genuinely unprecedented, and I don't know that most of us have the tools to deal with it. Why is it that we see uncertainty as something inherently negative or bad? And how might you suggest that we think about it?
Uncertainty is uncomfortable.
Mm.
I think there's no way around it. You can think about it biologically. When we were in the jungle and there was a noise in the bushes and you didn't know the source of that noise, uncertainty could have been lethal. And so our brains are wired to feel safe and secure when we are certain, when it's easy to predict what is to come, and feel incredibly uncomfortable and dissonant when we don't know what is to come, when we feel uncertain. This is particularly true today. If you are a business owner, you might be grappling with changing tariff policies and interest rates and geopolitical instability and precarity in the job market. It's hard to make investments in the future when the future feels so hard to predict. The problem is that because of our aversion to uncertainty, sometimes we opt for the safe bet, which isn't always the optimal bet. So think about it, thinking about this in the context of innovation or design. If you are trying to bring something original or net new to the world, it requires you to get to a point of uncertainty where you aren't sure exactly where you'll end up, and to keep going as opposed to opting for something that might feel expected or derivative or related to something that you've done before. I think this is the skill that lots of people who are real original thinkers, who are leading innovation at organizations, have cultivated over the course of their career. But it's getting increasingly hard to do as there's so much precarity swirling around us.
It's really interesting. I think you're right. The people who are sort of the most interesting innovators are much more comfortable with risk. Like they know that not every idea will be perfect or um, ideal. Like that I always think like 9 out of 10 of my ideas will be bad, but there will be one that will actually stand the test of time. And that time might only be 5 years, right? Like not every innovation is sort of the longest lasting thing. Um, but it is that idea that this is just a set of conditions we're operating in. Like it's not that I'm looking for certainty. I'm just sort of operating in a set of conditions and coming up with the best set of choices given the set of conditions. And I can get, if not entirely kind of comfortable, it's not a warm blanket, but I can get to some level of comfort with that, knowing that I'm making the best choices within the set of conditions I have to operate in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually a metaphor that I learned while I worked at IDEO that I think is instructive in moments like these, which is that being a leader or being an innovator is like sitting on a rowboat shrouded in heavy fog. So you're on this little boat, maybe on a lake, and there's fog all around you. You can't see very far in front of you, and you can't know exactly where you'll end up. But your job is to keep rowing, and to have faith that eventually you'll reach land. And I think that is the skill of being a leader in a particularly uncertain environment. You can think about this across industries. So imagine you are a scientist looking to make a breakthrough discovery, or an artist trying to produce really original work, or an entrepreneur trying to create a generational company. It requires you to be in that fog and to keep moving forward. because the minute you let the voice in your head that says this uncertainty is not tolerable, that's the minute where you start walking away from your potential, from what possibilities might be waiting on the other side of that fog. And so, yes, uncertainty is uncomfortable by design, but too often we only perceive the uncertainty as a threat without thinking about the other side, which is uncertainty is also the birthplace of possibility. All of these new, novel, original opportunities lie on the other side of your discomfort.
I love that phrase, that uncertainty can be the birthplace of opportunity. That's a really lovely way of looking at it. And it suddenly makes it seem less fearful. And I was actually going to go here. You know, you spent 3 years at IDEO as a design lead. I was going to ask you about how being here kind of shaped your thoughts around uncertainty, because if I think about a lot of the client projects that we work on, it almost feels like sitting with not knowing feels like a job requirement. Like sometimes a client comes to us and they think they know the answer. And we actually, as we sit with the problem, realize we're maybe not even solving the right problem. And I would love to know how that experience maybe shifted the way you think. You talk about the fog metaphor, which I really like.
I think in many ways, this book was born out of my experience working at IDEO. You know, one of IDEO's core values is to embrace ambiguity. And when you're working on a client project, it's sort of like the client is sitting in the rowboat with you, but you're holding the oars. And so, you know, if you're leading an innovation sprint or project, you need to be okay with moving through that fog and not jumping to those easy answers that are so alluring or so seductive. One example from a different organization, from Pixar, when a new director proposes a film idea to the creative team at Pixar, the rule is that they have to propose 3 different ideas. And the reason they do that is because you can get overly attached to your first idea, or overly attached to one particular strategy or one particular idea for a new product. That clouds your ability to see other opportunities that may be out there for you. Classic examples of companies like Kodak or BlackBerry or Blockbuster that were industry leaders but had very fixed, rigid strategic plans that prevented them from seeing the changing conditions around them.
Right.
When you're certain, it has a narrowing effect. If you're certain about who a person is based on maybe who they voted for in the last election, if you're certain about the direction of the market based on some forecast from some person on TV, it closes your mind. But when we're able to maintain that state of not knowing, when we're able to see uncertainty not necessarily as a problem to be solved, but as a state of being that might be temporary, might be uncomfortable, we're actually opening ourselves to more possibilities than we previously could have known.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that there's something about, as a professional and as a leader, trying to remain as open as possible for as long as possible to the opportunities. I think, we talk a lot, this, about divergent and convergent thinking. And there's a point where you just have to converge on a decision. The longer you can remain divergent and open to options is key. I do think sometimes, though, in the workplace, it becomes a challenge because that's not always what's rewarded. Like sometimes I think that this sense of decisiveness is what's rewarded, and it sometimes forces people into making decisions maybe sooner than they should. Maybe they should have been a little bit more open. So they force themselves to get attached to the first idea that flits across their frontal lobe because that's the thing that might get rewarded.
And we also need to, at some point, converge. We need to, at some point, decide. And I think what helps me is that there's this quote that I have in the book from this psychologist named Rollo May, and he says, "Commitment is healthiest not in the absence of doubt, but in spite of doubt."
Yeah.
And I think we can decide not knowing exactly how our decisions will turn out. Frankly, that is the truth for most decisions, especially about something that relates to the future. You can't know for sure the outcome of your decision before you make it. But you need two things. One is conviction. So some way to make the case for the bet that you're making or the path that you're choosing to take.
Right.
And you need openness to have humility in the face of your decision making, to stay open to the new data, the new information that may present itself in the future. I'll just tell a quick anecdote that I think might help concretize this a little bit.
Lovely.
So in the early 2010s, there was this gaming startup in the Bay Area, and it was sort of the belle of the ball. The company was called Tiny Speck, and the game was called Glitch, and they raised $17 million before they even had a game to promote. And their launch was covered in the New York Times, and there were tens of thousands of active players in the first few months. And yet, about 2 years into the company, the founder had the sneaking suspicion that the company wasn't on the right path, that the business wasn't sustainable. And so he did something that other people thought was crazy in the moment. He decided to shut the game down, sort of at the peak of its success. And he offered to make his investors whole, and he gave employees the opportunity to leave if they wanted to. And then with the remaining employees, he pivoted the company around this internal communications tool that they had built while they were building the game so they could collaborate. That communications tool is what we all today know as Slack, the most successful enterprise startup in recent memory. And the founder, Stuart Butterfield, if you'd listen to some of the interviews he gave around the time, he said, I didn't know exactly what our opportunity was. I didn't know whether this bet would pay off. It was the uncertainty that I was able to face. But by being willing to move toward what I didn't know, he was able to discover something that was greater than what he could have even imagined while he was building the gaming startup. And so I think that's really the promise of uncertainty tolerance. It's that you might discover things that you didn't even know would be a source of revenue for your business. You didn't even know would be a new interest that you might discover in your personal life. In statistics, they call this a local maxima, or transcending a local maxima. And the idea is you're standing on a mountain peak and you think you're on the top of the world, but there's actually a higher peak around the corner. But first you must be willing to descend that first peak to find that new possibility. I think a lot of our work at IDEO was helping leaders feel comfortable enough to explore what is around the corner.
That's perfect. That's such a good story. You earlier, you talked about how we're kind of wired to seek out certainty. We love the comfort of it. And in the book, you talk about the 3 ways that this desire for certainty becomes a liability for us. You talk about the certainty traps, comfort, hubris, and control. How did you land on those 3? And do you have stories about how that can show up in a business context? I actually really love the phrase certainty traps. I think that it's a really well thought through phrase.
Well, the original name for them was the 3 Horsemen of Delusion.
Also good.
My editor didn't like that very much. Every nonfiction book needs a framework, and these 3 traps are my framework. But I think they do point to things that make our desire for certainty so alluring. They are traps. Comfort is that voice that says, stay where you are. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. In a relationship context, maybe this is someone who's dating someone that they know isn't a great fit for them, but are unwilling to sort of leave the relationship to find out what else might be out there. In a business context, it's people who fall victim to the status quo bias, where they say, we've always done things this way and therefore we shouldn't change. Or, this is our bread and butter, this is our DNA, we can't reinvent who we are. The cost is that we miss out on the learning and the growth that comes from being outside of our comfort zone. Hubris is that voice that says, you know best. And maybe this is the most common thing that we hear from business leaders today. People projecting a false sense of certainty about exactly where the market or the industry or the world is heading. And on the other side of this hubris is the humility it takes to admit what we don't know. We often assume that the best leaders are the ones who have the most conviction, that have a 10-year vision for the future of the company, who know exactly how the market will respond to some black swan event that is yet to come. And yet the research shows that the best leaders aren't, in fact, know-it-alls. They are willing to admit what they don't know, and through that humility, garner more trust, not less trust, from their employees and from the market. And so on either extreme, you have the sort of know-it-all leaders that have too much pride, too much hubris. We don't want leaders who just throw up their hands and say, I don't know, who don't have any conviction or aren't willing to make any bets about the future. But the best leaders sit somewhere in between. They're willing to say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and these are the experiments we're running to figure it out. The third trap is control, which is perhaps the most pernicious of the three. Our desire for control can explain so much of our unwillingness to admit the true nature of reality, which is that the future is unknown. I see this all the time these days, especially with some of these conversations about AI and jobs. There's so much prediction out there, so many forecasts that people are peddling around. It's going to wipe out half of all entry-level jobs, or it's going to have this huge effect on the GDP, or the opposite take, which often experts are peddling as well. One of my favorite recent examples is there is this AI pioneer named Geoffrey Hinton, who gave this speech in 2016 about the future of radiology. And he basically said, we should stop training radiologists now. It is so completely obvious that in the next 5 years, 10 years max, this industry is going to become obsolete. Here we are 10 years later, and the Mayo Clinic, for one example, now employs 50% more radiologists than they did at Hinton's prediction. Now, this isn't to sort of disparage this AI pioneer by any means. It's to show that we are really bad as a species of predicting what is to come. And so on the other side of control is acceptance, is being able to accept all that we don't know and all that we can't control about the future. Especially for the people listening to this podcast, I imagine we have a lot of change makers in the IDEO community who want to make their dent in the universe. And I think this is actually very good news. The fact that we can't know exactly what the future holds, the fact that the future isn't written, is what empowers us to be part of that change. If we were all just sitting on a conveyor belt going toward a known destination, there would be no room for agency. But in that room is where we can all leave our marks.
Yeah, it's so funny that you brought up the Geoffrey Hinton story and the radiology story. I was actually I spent the last 2 days at the Future of Everything, and that very story came up. And I think for me, it was so interesting because, in fact, that was such a great story of possibility, because AI can see things that humans don't see, and humans see things that AI don't see. So it opens up all these possibilities for where radiology can go, in fact, where diagnostics can go. And to your point, it's about the agency. It's about what we can create. And so what I've noticed with futurists is that very few of them actually worry about whether their predictions are actually right. They're really much more interested in opening up the possibility of where thinking can go. And when you talk about control in particular, I started my career as a project manager, and I used to tell young project managers that control is an illusion. The idea that we can actually control the future. All you can do is think about a set of conditions you're operating in and the best decision you can make. But you might be standing on a beach later and have made all the best laid plans, and the fog rolls in or the rain starts, and you didn't bring an umbrella because there was no rain forecast. It didn't mean you made bad decisions. It mean the conditions changed, and that's all that you can. You now have to just change your plan. And to be able to get comfortable with, okay, now I'm changing the plan, and what happens next is sort of the skill that we all need to develop. Because this is just, I think the mistake that people are making now is this idea that this is just a storm we can weather and eventually everything will be easy to predict again. I think this is just the new normal, and it's the environment we operate in. So your point about developing uncertainty tolerance as a skill, I think, is really a valuable one for all of us.
I hope so. It's the reason why I wrote the book, first and foremost, because I am anxious about the future. I am naturally indecisive. I love to play my own devil's advocate. I love to think of all the reasons why something won't go right and stay in that ruminative place. And yet I know that being able to persist in spite of the doubt, in spite of the uncertainty we feel is necessary. And as you mentioned, the world is only going to accelerate. This rapid change is just the beginning. You can think about it from a technological perspective. You can think about it from a climate perspective. You can think about it from a geopolitical perspective. But sticking your head in the sand and thinking things are going to go back to the way they were is a delusion. And so whether it's you navigating the future of your career or the future of your organization or just a decision in your personal life, being willing to tolerate the unknown, that is the meta skill that will help carry you through.
When I think about the traps that you mentioned, they're all sort of versions of that fundamental mistake, this idea that we can just, if we think hard enough, we can think our way to certainty. And I want to probe there a little bit. We've talked about this before, actually, this idea that, we live in this world where the world doesn't even just keep promising us more information. Thanks to this little computer that's in every one of our pockets, we are possibly the most informed generation in history. And for those who can't see me, who are just listening, I'm holding up my phone. And we keep thinking that if we have more information, we can solve any problem, we control more things, because we have better data, better models, more research. I used to be a marketer, and just the promise of big data, we just felt like we would have all the answers, and I've never really felt like I had all the answers. And now we're more informed than any generation, but we're also more anxious and maybe more scared than any other generation about the future than ever. And you have some really good stories in the book, one about the Federal Reserve, but it's, I think, just a really good illustration of this. That, I mean, gosh, talk about an organization that has so much data. But I think you make the point that all of this information, all of this data hasn't made us feel more secure, more certain, especially in the environment that we operate in now.
I think phones do two things. One is they create the expectation that answers should be readily available. Whereas maybe 10 years ago, I might have been okay not knowing the name of a given actor. Now I feel this almost involuntary need to know, to reach into my pocket and find out. And the second thing they do is they bring all of the uncertainties of the world right to the fore. So, for example, I'm a new dad. I can put an app on my phone that tracks where my son is at every moment of the day. And yet access to more information has not made me wiser or more grounded. It often just fuels my anxiety. The same could be said of being able to track a crisis on the other side of the world in real time. And so, given the nature of these computers that we carry around in our pockets, we're also robbing ourselves of the practice of sitting with what we don't know. I think, like any tolerance, we build it through exposure, through consciously exposing ourselves to an uncertain situation where we don't know how it'll turn out, by sparking that conversation with a stranger that you're not exactly sure where it'll go, by sitting in the messiness of the creative process as opposed to wanting generative AI to fill in the solution for you. And that is the reason why our tolerance is in decline. Our skills to tolerate what we don't know are atrophying precisely because it has never been easier to find a false sense of certainty.
Yeah, I think I shared with you once that I feel really lucky that my kids actually are not very attached to their phones at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that they're okay with sort of contemplation of things. So they'll ask each other questions and then sort of ruminate on the answer. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night because I heard noises downstairs, and it was actually my two kids arguing about presidents of all things. And then one of them said, "No, no, you're forgetting about Grover Cleveland or something." And it's like, yeah, who doesn't forget about Grover Cleveland? But the fact that they were even having that conversation and nobody had their phone open, they
Mm-hmm.
were just arguing about like accomplishments of different presidents.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you really hit the nail on the head with something, which is that we want this sort of instant knowledge because we think it's going to solve something or get us closer to some kind of an answer that makes us feel more comfortable or more certain. Um, but there is something lost in that lost contemplation time or that sort of um, almost like mental friction that that helps you sort of think about, was my answer right or wrong? Have I come up with the right solution for something? Um, Everything from, is this the right solution, to, should I really be doing this? Like, I think the loss of shame around certain behaviors is actually a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of this lost contemplation time because we don't have time to think about the consequences of our actions as much, or we don't give ourselves that time. Um, and I think the phone is a little bit, we don't give ourselves enough silent time to do some of those things.
Yeah, that loss of friction, I think, is one of the main ailments of society these days.
Mm,
Because it robs us of two things. One is the meaning that comes from the struggle.
right.
And the second is the ability to actually retain the information that you are learning in the moment. So there's this fascinating
Yeah.
study from MIT recently that looked at computer assisted essay writing. And they had three groups. They had a group that used generative AI, they had a group that used Google, and there was a group that didn't reference any of these external tools.
Right.
And they found that the group that used generative AI remembered almost nothing from the essays that they had produced. There's a metaphor that I read, which I think is resonant for me at least, which is using generative AI to solve really hard problems is like taking a helicopter to the end of a hike. You might get there faster, but you miss out on all the reasons why the hike was worth doing. And so, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not sort of anti using some of these tools. I think they're going to be an integral part of everyone's workflow. But we have to keep an eye on what might be lost through the automation. And for example, I am a writer. I love the toil of trying to find the right words. And I feel the seduction of just letting the autocomplete on steroids fill in the rest of the article or the piece that I'm working on. I have to use my agency as a human to resist the easy option, the donut that's sitting next to the healthy option on the table, because I know that it's through the friction that I find meaning in my work.
Absolutely. Um, you talk about how uncertainty tolerance is something that we can build or develop. I like this idea. It's a lot like one of my favorite things about the book Creative Confidence is how the Kellys talk about how creative confidence is like a muscle you can build or activate and then use in your everyday life. But what are some real ways that you think people can build their uncertainty tolerance?
One is just by reflecting on moments of uncertainty that you've been able to make it through in the past. We all suffer from what psychologists call the end of history illusion, which is when we think back to our past, it's easy to say all the ways that we've changed. how our preferences have changed, how our personalities have changed, how our desires have changed, how we've faced moments of friction, of anguish, of adversity, and been able to transcend them. And yet, when we think about our future, our tendency is to think that we are relatively fixed, that our desires, our needs, our tastes today will remain for the rest of our lives. And so one thing that I often remind people is that you have made it through uncertainty before. And that knowledge can help build your confidence in facing uncertainty again. Another thing that I think is helpful in building uncertainty tolerance is actually to remind yourself of the things that will remain constant amid all the change. So I think about these sort of like certainty anchors. What are the boulders that will remain steady amidst all the changing winds? For an organization, maybe that's a commitment to a certain set of values or to serving a particular customer. For an individual, maybe that's your commitment to your home or to your spouse. But getting clear on what you are certain about makes it easier to hold uncertainty in other realms of your life. And the last thing I'll say is something that feels very IDEO coded, which is we must be willing to build to learn. We must be willing to create prototypes and put them out into the world. And that is the type of exposure therapy that I think is very helpful, both in our personal lives and in a business context. You might not think that taking a new route to work or going to a restaurant that you've never been to will fundamentally change your relationship to uncertainty, but research actually shows microdosing uncertainty, exposing yourself in these little ways to uncertain environments, rewires our brain to be more tolerant when we face those bigger uncertainties in our lives. The same can be true in a business context. By giving yourself the permission to generate ideas that might never go to market, or to fail, or to build things without knowing how they might turn out, is the type of culture building that leads to more organizational uncertainty tolerance. At IDEO, we had this saying, never come to a meeting without a prototype. And I love it. It's true for life as well. The fastest way to learn, to get more certainty, to get more clarity, is not by just thinking about problems, but actually building to learn and seeing what you might find out.
I really love that idea of sort of building and trying new things. You know, it's something that there's a story in your book that I think about, and it's the gentleman who sort of let his life be ruled by algorithms and then realized that he was doing that. And because it's something that my husband and I were discussing, because he listens to the same music all the time. And it's a little bit of a joke in our house because there's a lot of yacht rock that plays in our house. And I make a point actually on my Spotify. I listen to a lot of the same stuff, but I will listen to the new mixes or daily mixes at least once or twice a week that Spotify creates for me. And I end up liking probably 5 out of 20 songs that it gives me, but it does expose me to new music that I would never, or new artists that I would never have sought out myself because I wouldn't have thought to look for them. And that leads me to a different set of artists or a different type of music that I hadn't maybe considered before. And he asked me once, like, how do you find this new music? And I said, I just click on a button to try something different. And he's like, you chose to do that. And I said, yeah, like if otherwise, like how else would I do it? And sometimes I'll just ask my kids to like recommend something different to me. Because they'll definitely choose something I wouldn't have chosen. And it's just the only way that I'll get exposure. Otherwise, I kind of get locked in my little music loop, right? And just that idea of like, in a way, that's sort of me prototyping new tastes, right? Because if I don't sort of experiment, how would I ever how would I ever just sort of break out of that loop? And so I do like that idea of maybe bust the algorithm a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's very safe. It's not like, oh no, I'm trapped and now I'm only going to ever have to listen to crunk for the rest of my life or something. It's like very easy. And so that idea of like just, opening the door a little bit, widening the aperture a little bit in some safe area of your life, it feels like an experiment, but it's a very low risk one, I think, that helps you sort of just widen it a little tiny, tiny bit.
Yeah, there's this idea from theoretical computer science that I think gets to the heart of this problem, and it's called the explore-exploit trade-off. So let's take the Spotify example. Imagine your job was to design the Spotify algorithm.
Right.
And so your job is to choose the next song that plays for your user. You have sort of two choices. One is you can exploit, which is to say, play a song that is similar to other songs that you know this user likes. And your other choice is to explore, which is to play something that you aren't sure whether they'll like or not. Now, there are trade-offs to both. If you exploit, the probability of the user liking the song is higher. You're making decisions based on the data that you already have. But the downside is you could very easily bore the user by just overplaying the same type of music again and again. When you explore, the downside is very clear. You can play something that the user won't like, and maybe they'll close the app. But the upside is that you might discover something that the user likes that you didn't previously know. It's sort of like expanding your character map of what is available. And so life is a balance between these two extremes. We all need to both exploit sometimes and explore other times. It might be dictated by your age. If you're older and you're more calcified in your ways, maybe you do a little bit more exploitation and less exploring. When you're young and still trying to figure out who you are, maybe it's necessary for you to do a little bit more exploring and less exploiting. But whatever age, whatever phase you're at, whatever level you are in the career hierarchy, it's important to keep both of those in mind, because too much of one or the other is not an optimal solution.
Absolutely. Earlier, you talked about leaders having to find that balance between nobody likes a leader who just sort of throws up their hand and says, I don't know. But at the same time, uh, there is trust that can be built by being the person who says, I don't know, and then tries to figure out like where to go next. And I think that there is a little bit of tension in that for a leader to be the person who says, I don't know, in front of their team.
Mm-hmm.
There's that tension between wanting to appear decisive and confident, especially in uncertain times, um, but also wanting to build that trust and credibility. How do you think leaders can find that balance or figure out a way to make that balance work for themselves?
I'll answer with an example, which is in the book I profile Brian Chesky and how he handled the pandemic as the leader of Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you are running a global travel company and global travel gets shut down, it's about as uncertain of a economic environment as you could possibly imagine. And I learned a few things from Brian that I think are applicable to leaders in different industries as well. The first thing that he did is he wrote down a list of his values, of what he wanted to stay true, who he wanted to be in the face of this crisis. And they were things like, don't be a villain, try to win the next travel season, keep all stakeholders in mind. And so these values became sort of a rubric for when he was making a decision. He wasn't sure about the outcome, but he could come back to this question of who do I want to be in spite of not knowing exactly what is to come. Another thing that he did, he brought more clarity to the process. So when in the past he used to have all hands meetings every other week, he made those every week. He used to meet with his leadership team once a week. He made those daily meetings. And so for his employees who were struggling with their own uncertainty about whether they'd have jobs, about whether the company would continue to exist, he didn't necessarily have more answers than other leaders, but he brought certainty to the process so they could know what they could rely on. I'm going to get an update today. Sometimes that update might be we have no new information to share, but I'm not going to let my mind spiral about what all these catastrophizing worst case scenarios because I feel like the people in charge have a structure in place. And then the last thing he did was he really used the pandemic as a helpful constraint to refocus the company on new opportunities. So in the past, the organizational design and the focus of Airbnb was very diffuse. They had a magazine and they were doing short-term rentals and they were exploring experiences. And they had all of these different business units that sort of functioned as if they were independent companies, each with their own back of house function and marketing teams. And what he did is he created one singular product roadmap and then started releasing products similar to a hardware company where twice a year there would be reliable releases. And he really refocused the business on the core of their offering. And I think that is the opportunity of being able to, as the proverb goes, never waste a crisis, is to use the constraint as an opportunity for creativity. And so for other leaders out there, they can over-communicate. They can bring clarity to the process, even if they don't know exactly what the results will be. And most important, they can figure out their anchors, figure out the things that will remain true, regardless of whether the stock goes up and down or whether you hit your sales goal in the next quarter.
At the end of the book, you offer some invitations, ways to start living with uncertainty differently. One that really stuck with me is this idea of letting go of ghost ships. I love this phrase. Can you explain to the listeners what a ghost ship is?
So the image comes from Cheryl Strayed, the famed author, and she used to write this advice column called Dear Sugar. And one time someone wrote in asking this question about whether or not they should have kids. And Cheryl conjures this image of you standing on a dock about to board a ship. And that decision to step on a ship is like making a decision that represents one life that you could potentially lead. At the same moment that you step on that ship, a fleet of other ships also disembark and go out into the sea. I love this idea of all of these ships floating around the open water. And the ship that you're on is the life that you are living. Each of these other ships is a life that you could have led, but you've chosen not to. And what she advises is you have to be willing to wave at those other ghost ships, to wave at those lives that you could have led, to be okay making a decision, knowing that it might foreclose other opportunities, but also knowing it allows you to gain whatever it is that you are choosing. I think so often when we're standing at that crossroads, in the moment before you make a decision, it's very easy to see all that you're giving up, the opportunity cost of the choice that you make. And that's why so often making a decision feels like a loss, because you're acutely aware of all that you're not doing. And by making any choice, it requires you to say goodbye to them. But the wisdom in Cheryl's image of the ghost ships is that the alternative is that you're just standing on the shore. The alternative is that you are not deciding. And through your indecision, you're letting life pass you by. There's this great image from the Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath that I think about a lot, which is at the end of the book, she's sitting underneath a fig tree. And all the figs represent different people that she could have been. She could have been an Olympian. She could have married this man or that man. She could have moved to Paris. And she spends all this time contemplating which fig to choose. But in the indecision, the figs are going rotten. They're ripening to a point where they fall off the tree and are no longer able to be picked. And so this idea of being able to say goodbye to the ships that did not carry you is an acknowledgement that in order to live your life, you can't live all these different lives at once. You have to make your choice and be okay with the choices that you didn't make.
I love this imagery because I do think that we have a tendency to think about regret so much more than we think about possibility. Um, in the book, you actually talk about Daniel Kahneman and this whole like prospect theory and loss aversion. We have this whole tendency to think about that, and it really resonated with me on many fronts. I was thinking of it because I have been through a divorce, and I used to get up every morning and I would be like washing my hair in the shower. It's where I do all my thinking. The team will tell you I show up a lot and say, "Okay, I was in the shower the other day and I had a thought," and and I would get up every day and be washing my hair, and I would be like, am I making a mistake? Am I making a mistake? And then one day I just had the epiphany of like, there is no mistake. There's just a decision. I am living one way before this decision and then one way after the decision. And the notion of the ghost ship sort of made me think of that moment of stop thinking about everything like a choice where there's a right or a wrong choice. There's just a choice. And then there's a whole different set of choices on the other side of this choice. And but the ghost ship was just such a beautiful way of thinking about that by making this one set of choices, you now open up all these opportunities for new choices for you on the other side of that choice. And it would just be nice if we could kind of live more in that mindset, this notion of possibility and opportunity, as opposed to kind of the scarcity that we like, but I don't want to let go of all of these old things. So I loved that kind of visual that you painted for us. I just thought it was so lovely.
Thanks for saying so. Yeah, and I think the other thing that it sort of brings up for me is there are certain decisions in our life that are really like stepping on a ship, that are really sort of irreversible. Decisions like who to marry or, whether to buy this house. These are the types of decisions that really require a thoughtful analytical framework, that you want to take your time making those types of decisions. But the majority of the decisions we make are not as consequential. We tend to discount our own ability to course correct or to adapt, even if they were to go horribly wrong. They're what Jeff Bezos sometimes refers to as two-way door decisions, where if you walk through the door, you realize you made a mistake, you can often walk back through the door again. And too often, we bring the sort of analytical frameworks of one-way door decisions to two-way door decisions. And that's part of what I love about the IDEO ethos of prototyping, of bringing things to market, of building low fidelity prototypes and seeing how they are responded to, is that it makes these decisions that we make a little bit less precious. It is a reminder that the best way to learn is through the doing and not through the thought experiments or sitting around the table and pontificating about what we might build.
I love that. Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question before we go into our lightning round. That's a little bit of a warning about the lightning round coming up. If someone listening right now is in the middle of something genuinely hard, a decision they can't fully see, a team that's anxious, a direction that isn't clear, gosh, who isn't in the middle of one of these things? What is one thing you'd want them to take away from this conversation?
I'll bring in an idea from this philosopher named Ruth Chang. And what Ruth says is that what makes a hard decision hard is not that there's a good answer and a bad answer and you're just too stupid to see. What makes a hard decision hard is one option is better for some reasons, another option is better for other reasons, and neither option is better overall. And so what she advises is, rather than agonizing about which option to choose, make your choice and then spend your energy convincing yourself of the reasons why you made the right choice. It's this idea of, instead of thinking there is a right choice to make, how can you make the choice right? And I love it because it gives us all a little bit of control back from the universe to say that you can be the author of your own story and you can convince yourself that you made the right choice. Often our choices in life are just about which trade-offs are we most willing to accept. And so that can be hopefully a little bit of an empowering message to end on that lowers the stakes of some of these decisions that we often treat as if they were life or death.
Thank you for that. That's excellent. Okay, so now we're going to go into the lightning round. These are meant to be fun, so don't overthink them. They can just be quick answers. I have it to.
Okay.
That's as much for me as anybody else. I overthink everything. I should wear it on a T-shirt. All right. What book, TV show, or movie would you recommend to our listeners?
I'll recommend a TV show. My wife and I have been rewatching this show on HBO called High Maintenance, which is about a weed dealer in New York City. But the protagonist, the weed dealer, is actually the least important character in the show. And it's really a series of profiles of the different people that he's selling weed to. And I love it because, I'm a narrative journalist and each episode is just a snapshot into a person's life. So there's someone who is obsessively collecting La Croix cans, and there's someone who is a professional surprise designer, and there's someone who is an opera singer, and there's someone who is a high-powered lawyer. In each episode, you get this sort of voyeuristic snapshot into how other people are living.
Excellent. Who is a creative thinker that you look up to?
I love the ambient musician Brian Eno. Listeners of the show might be familiar with his work, but one thing he said once that has stuck with me is he says, I want to create music unlike music that's ever existed. And, on one hand, like what a high bar to set for yourself. But on the other hand, like this real push for originality and to try and bring net new things to the world. And I think that philosophy is really inspiring to me.
Excellent. What is a skill you're currently working on?
My wife and I are learning how to salsa dance, which comes very easily to her because she's a dancer and comes very slowly to me because I am not as fluid. But it's so fun. It's so fun to move your body. It's so fun to be exposed to music, to connect with other people through touch and movement as opposed to through words. And for a natural overthinker like me, it's really nice to feel embodied.
What is a skill you're proud of?
Maybe a bit of an irony given I've done all the answering, but I love asking questions. I think that is really the skill of a journalist and something that I've honed over time. And I feel that I'm most sort of in my element when I'm chatting with a source and I get to ask them questions to learn.
What's a mistake that you've learned from?
I have a tendency to be very black and white in my thinking. So, for example, before I came to work at IDEO, I was working at the Atlantic and I left to join this job at IDEO. And I thought it was going to be the end of my writing career. I thought, my journalistic colleagues would never have me back. And it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to my writing career. I was able to write my first book because I chose to leave the newsroom. And so I try and put that sort of black and white thinking at an arm's distance and stay in the gray as much as I can.
That's so interesting because I would never have guessed that about you. What is a philosophy you live by?
My favorite food is chocolate chip cookies. And I live by the philosophy that if I ever want to eat the cookie, I should always eat the cookie. I had a cookie for like every single day of 4 years of college. And if there's ever a cookie that looks good, I try and short circuit my tendency to say like, oh, is it worth it? Have you already had too many sweets? I always go for the cookie because I know it brings me joy.
You know what? It is always worth it. What advice would you give to your younger self?
There's just Maya Angelou quote that is something along the lines of forgive yourself for not learning the things that you learned until you learned them. Or maybe it's forgive yourself for not knowing the things that you hadn't yet learned, something along those lines. And I wish I had known that as my younger self. Like I put a lot of pressure on myself to try and figure out who I wanted to be when I grow up. And now I'm in my sort of mid-30s, and I still don't know who I want to be when I grow up. But I think that is part of the fun. That's part of the adventure of living a creative life. And so I would say, chill out.
I think that's great advice. I'm not in my mid-30s, and I still feel like I need to give myself that advice. So thank you for the reminder. And thank you for spending this time with us today. This has been just an excellent conversation. And I hope our listeners will get as much out of it as I have. I think it's been terrific.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Mina, for having me. And yeah, the book, How to Not Know, it's out everywhere books are sold. I hope you check it out.